By the way, a bit of finished artwork behind you too.
All right.
Mm.
So
It was the Young Finnish Artist of the Year. Anyway, sorry.
cool. No, we're sitting in front of some finished artwork with Patrick Johnson, my fellow husband of a Finnish woman. Um, we're doing a series here called 5 Business Concepts for Every Engineer. Thanks, Patrick, for joining us.
You're welcome.
So quickly to take you guys through a review of the 5 concepts. We have strategy, which of course means nothing new age or high energy. It simply means whether we should be investing internally to grow a capability or to grow our size, or whether we should be looking for inorganic growth, which we've covered before, which is to either team up with another company or do a joint venture for a specific product, or if we have the cash or assets to actually buy out another company that's doing exactly what we're looking to do. And as we've discussed, the best trade-off positively for that is that you have revenue to show immediately for the dollars that you're tying up for the moment. Whereas if you invest internally, the revenue is not going to be there for a little bit. The other strategic options, of course, are to spin off a part of your company that is not doing what you want it to do or how you want it to perform. And the final option, of course, strategically, is to do nothing. Sometimes the problem is not at a strategic level; it's at an operational level. So you should always be thinking about operations as price times volume minus fixed cost minus variable cost. Uh, we'll talk more about that once we get started with Patrick. The final 2 corners of our internal framework, of course, are organization. Patrick will be able to talk to you a lot about that. He's an expert and has to interact with many, many different parts of the organization simply due to the structure of their company. And lastly, there's finance, and that is something that you should always be thinking of in terms of whether you're going to cash finance a project or an enterprise, whether you're going to issue debt or you're going to give out equity in exchange for the capital you need to do what you're doing. So with that, we will quickly review the external factors that are beyond your enterprise, but that will influence your decision and impact how you go forward. And the acronym you should be remembering is Special T. Kind of corny, but very effective. So the S is supplier base, supply chain management. You're going into a new market. It might seem perfect in every other way except getting the supply chain management going is a higher barrier to entry than setting up production, setting up the market. Next is public reaction. This is most relevant for publicly traded companies, but you should keep it in mind even if you're working in a private company that is looking to go public in the future. The next is the overall economy. Not surprising that this would influence your decisions, but if you're interacting with other economies, you should certainly know the local artifacts. The next, of course, is competition. Now, competition interplays with price. Competition largely drives how much you can charge for each of your products or each of your services. And then you also have to, it keeps recording, so. You also have to keep in touch with what your competitors are offering, but really you can think of it as an ongoing measurable in terms of price. And then what is the state of the industry? The pains of the industry will always be your pains as well, unless you have some kind of advantage that your competitors in the industry don't. And sometimes those advantages can come from being in a conglomerate where you have resources of other industries because your parent company does other business. And then we'll move on to audit. That's something we'll cover in more detail. Patrick may be able to tell us more about how much audit influences his work. Then the L and the T are laws and technology. technology you guys know about, and laws greatly can determine your decisions. There's legislation that can limit what you want to do or can enable what you want to do. And we'll go through each of these items with Patrick, but Patrick is in a large organization, which is a roll-up of previously existing smaller organizations that largely do the same thing. Did the same thing.
Complementary.
Okay.
There are many companies that do the same thing, and there are many complementary services. So we generally have between probably a minimum of one and a maximum of about 5 or 6 companies that do the same thing in any market, given market.
Very cool. Now, is a consolidated roll-up a fair summary of what your company's been doing?
I think it has been a combination of 3 different things. The first one is building of scale, and so many of the initial acquisitions were simply to build scale. And there are certain parts of our business where scale is absolutely critical to success. The second one has been filling voids. So if we had particular companies that were quote unquote global, but they had parts missing, you needed to fill in those. And then the third one I would say is experimental. It's sort of delving into new areas and seeing what develops and where we should be placing our bets in the future.
Very cool. So would you say the scale phase is pretty much complete now, or is that something you guys continue to do?
Pretty much. So, a little bit, our company is the largest marketing services organization in the world.
You're free to say who it is?
WPP, yep.
Great.
And it really has a series of components where we have the second largest market research firm in the world, a company called Kantar, and it's second in the world to Nielsen. We try and be number 1 or 2 in each market. And we have a very, very large media unit, a series of global advertising networks and digital networks, and then we sort of have a specialized services, which is a catch-all, if you like, of other. And there are many, many, many companies in that group. Media, in particular, scale is critical because you have vast buying power, and it enables you to negotiate better on behalf of clients and get them better pricing and better opportunities for placement. So certainly in the scale side of things, media is critical.
So, Patrick here is referring to the variable cost aspect. One of the ways they deliver value to their customers is to buy on scale, right? Think about buying media hours or what else?
So we're the single largest media buyer in the world on every platform.
Every medium, every platform.
So we're Google's largest client. We are NBC's largest client. You pretty much name it, whether it's print, newspaper, TV, cable, digital. We have the largest media company in the world. It's a roll-up of several companies called Group M. And the scale enables them to firstly just get competitive pricing on behalf of their clients. Because the more buying power you've got, the more you can negotiate those sorts of pricing. But the other thing that becomes critical in media is where and when you place the advertisement. Prime example is if there is a hit show and there are only so many 30-second spots, 30-second advertisements through that show. If you are one of the big players, you have a better chance of getting the spots that the client wants on that show.
So, wholesale, keep in mind, you're not only getting the discount, but Patrick's company is also making buys that you can't buy except with scale. So it's the discount and the quality of the buy on the cost side. And then can you tell us a little bit, Patrick, about how you guys do the pricing, because you're delivering this value?
So there are I guess a couple of different ways that happens. We can negotiate lower, pretty straightforward. We can negotiate lower prices for our clients, and that happens on a case by case basis. But it also, it's sort of one of those cyclical systems whereby if you have the better buying power that you can buy these things, then more clients want to use you as well. So it's sort of one of those self-perpetuating elements of it. But the main way we pass on those discounts to a client, but we win probably more business because we're able to achieve those things.
Very cool. So would you say then it's still a price-based model, cost-based model that based on which you price your product to your client, or is it not that transparent to the client?
It is transparent to the client.
Okay.
It is it didn't used to be.
Right.
It has become far more transparent to the client, although I would say it is fair to say that if a given client spends, let's say, 100 million or even $1 billion on media, they are intimately involved in working with us on the strategy side of things. It is probably safe to say that the machinery that goes on the actual transaction side of things is a step removed. The number of buys we do and the number of opportunities there are out there are just enormous. So we are acting on behalf of a lot of clients at once, all of whom have competing interests, and there are a multitude of suppliers, all of whom are trying to maximize what their opportunities are, as well as maximize the competitive pricing on an upward scale, while we're trying to maximize the downward scale. So we're trying to drive it down, they're trying to drive it up. So there's this sort of supply and demand element of it going on. Now, the pricing competitiveness is particularly pertinent in the buying side of things. So media splits into two. It has the buying, where you're doing all of that negotiation, of the placement, of the medium you're using and how many you're buying and all that side of things. There's also the strategy side. Now, some would argue that strategy is a also cost competitive area, but I think it's safe to say that if you're very good on media strategy, people want to use you.
Very good, very good. So let's talk about the organization a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We've covered in earlier lectures where conglomerates, they go ahead and they buy the companies that they want to do the product that they were looking to do or to achieve the revenue growth that they were looking to achieve, but often they don't synchronize and synergize. They just allow the companies to continue to exist in the previous way that they existed, and they miss a lot of best practices. So I've covered with the audience that you can take the best practices, the winning best practice from each of the acquisitions, and make that in a DNA fashion the new best practice across the board as applicable. Now, a roll-up is a little bit different in that each of the companies is doing the same industry. As Patrick pointed out, there are differences within the industry and what each of the companies could be doing. But would you say it's pretty much you're still within one industry, or?
Yeah.
Okay. So can you tell us, Patrick, about how much you guys synergize and how much you let the companies be what they were before the acquisition?
I think this is an area where there is always a conflict, and it's always a balancing act of the culture versus the operations. Our holding company, so the parent company of the whole thing, is very small. We have, including associates, about 160,000 plus employees. and the holding company is ballpark 300. So it's quite a small team. That probably gives some insights into how much control that small team has,
right.
because there's just not a lot of people when you've got
right
bandwidth growth
limited, right?
Now, so what that means is that many of these large global networks run themselves and are left alone to make their best decisions. That has pros and cons. The pro is that they maintain a hopefully vibrant culture, and the culture that built, you mentioned the word DNA, but that maintains that DNA of what they were. And I would say an excellent example of that is Ogilvy, which is a very storied advertising network and still has a real culture to them. But that conflicts at times with the best practice side of things. They have their own best practices, but those best practices may not, and they may be unique and actually a real benefit to them. But there may be some others where working with the other companies or synergizing certain parts may be easy. Now, what I would, I could give one example of this where we have a very, very large competitor called Publicis. Publicis, it's a French-based company. It's about half our size, but it's a very, very large company. It's the third largest advertising group in the world. And they, over the past 15 odd years, built a very large and robust shared services operation. So it does finance, it does to some extent HR, facilities management, buildings and real estate and things like that. That is where they have spread best practice. Now, you could debate endlessly whether that is the ideal, but it is one way where they have synergized across the group while leaving the culture out in the operating companies. We have not done that across our group, although we're always looking at it and kicking the tires on it. So there's no right answer, but they're constantly, I think, to some extent, the ability to synergize and maintain culture is always a challenge, particularly in the service industry. Less of an issue in the product industry. A bolt is a bolt is a bolt, to some extent. But very, very important in the service industry.
Very cool. And, Patrick, the audience will really appreciate the numbers you gave, because that's the way we as engineers actually try to approach every problem. And I think that the numbers you gave is going to have a tremendous impact on how people view, the control system resources versus the resources of what's being controlled. Now, Patrick, before we move on to the next organization, I'd like to actually ask you to describe your actual formal role, what it is that you do for WPP.
When you figure it out, you can tell me. So I have a couple of different roles. WPP has sort of four large strategies, and let's see, it's new media. So there is a huge emergence of digital media, for instance, and that being at our forefront. New markets. So being, we went in very, very early into India and into China, sort of 15, 20 years ago, and have enormous market share in those two markets. We've recently gone into Burma, for instance. Sorry, not Burma, what is it now? Myanmar.
That's what it is this year.
yeah. But, so there's the new market side of things. And we are growing far faster than any competitors in those new geographic areas. The third one is consumer insights. So I mentioned that we owned Kantar, which is the second largest research firm in the world. Basically, we're the only one in our industry who has that sort of capability. Some competitors might have it on a very, very minor scale, but probably 2% of what we've got. And then the last one is what our CEO, Sir Martin Sorrell, has termed horizontality. And really what that refers to is that we have these large global networks that are verticals. Right? We have 4 or 5 advertising networks. We have large media networks, digital networks, our consumer insights business, etc. And they, to some extent, are siloed. What has been happening over the past 10 plus years is that clients have been looking for talent and capabilities and have somewhat tired of choosing between a network to find that talent, because the talent's moving, the people. And even within a network, you might have greatness one year, and then another one might try something new next year, and so it turns into a headache. So what we have started doing is winning business at the holding company level that can be placed anywhere in the group. So you might have a team working out of one company and a team working out of the other company, and they work together. And so it's all about supplying best talent. Now that is what what's called in the press is called team accounts, because they're working as a team. Our CEO refers to it as horizontality, and I'm working for the team that manages that process. It's called Global Client Operations, and we are actively involved in some of those assignments on a day-to-day basis. Some of them we take more of a consultative capacity, and so I work for that team. On a day-to-day basis, I am CFO, COO of one of our client relationships, which is between WPP and one of their largest clients, managing the structure. We have about 30 plus, 35 plus agencies working on the business, and a large number of people. And these are agencies that were competitors 5 years ago, die-hard competitors 5 years ago. And we have them working in an integrated fashion on this client, where they can go in and out of each other's buildings. They are working as teams. It's challenging, but it's what our CEO believes is the future, and so that's the path we're going down.
Cool. So it's one, organization-based featuring, not strategy-based, which we've discussed previously. Companies get hung up on strategy, and then once they've implemented their strategy, they don't implement the organizational changes. Now, you'll notice, and this is without any prompting, Patrick described his function relative to his organization, and that is something you'll see consistently, something that you'll see as consistent among all leaders. And one of our shortcomings as engineers before we're exposed to business is that we describe our function based on the tasks that we do. And when I asked Patrick, he gave you a description of his organization, and his role was merely a function of that description. So that's something you should strive to do going forward. Not only if you're an employee of a large corporation or even of a small corporation, but even if you're doing consulting work, you should understand where your client, the actual persons that you interact with, where they fit within their organization. And that should define your identity in terms of your role, either as a consultant or as an employee. That being said, we'll move on to the next chunk. So the only disclaimer I put on all this, Patrick, is that we're not covering treasury.
Mm-hmm. I worked for Treasury for a couple of years, funnily enough. So
this framework is to equip and prepare engineers for every other aspect of business than treasury. But we do want engineers to understand the financing of their project or of the enterprise at an operations level. And I always tell them to think of it as a decision that's to be made between usage of cash, issuing of debt, or issuing of equity, and or some combination of the three. Can you tell us how much decision making you have to do in your CFO function from that standpoint?
In my current role, less than I've had to do in the past.
Okay.
And part of that is because there are existing companies and agencies that are making those decisions on a day-to-day basis for everything they're doing. So I am probably managing operationally client interaction and execution, but less management of any given company. Certainly staffing decisions and things like that, but not longer-term strategic investment decisions. I have done in the past. I was CFO of a previous company that we divested between 40 and 50% of the company while I was there, and I was sort of the lead on the team to do that. I think what you're talking about is sort of the value basis of the proposition, right? So you have got, is it actually a valuable investment? You know, and how do you finance it? And then to some extent, how do you sell the value of that decision?
Excellent. I did not prompt him on any of this. This is the raw stuff. That's why this is the framework.
Okay. So the part of the reason why I started the organisation, I talked about my role is context. Every person will enter a room with different expectations and agendas and knowledge base of their areas. Unless you tie it in with the organisation as a whole, it is often very difficult for people to identify sort of how they interact, firstly whether it's of any value to them, secondly whether it is going to put an onus on them either from a time or a responsibilities or a financial situation, and thirdly, you know, it's a respectful mechanism simply because they've got a hell of a lot going on, and for them to either be to sort of earmark time and effort to go along with you or not is just, I think, a good business practice. So, you know, I think that's ultimately what you're getting at in terms of the overall. You know, I think the element you've talked about in terms of the funding sources, whether it's cash, whether it's debt, or whether it's equity, those tend to be one of the last ones in the cycle. And part of the reason is, you know, if you are making a decision between renting a house or buying a house, or doing some other method of finding accommodation, you tend to make the decision first about whether you want to live and what you need. Right. And so that tends to be the tail end of it, right? When you're figuring out what that is. And I think that the upfront strategy and figuring out whether there is an absolute value to it is far more difficult, complicated, but critical than any of the stuff that flows after that.
Very cool. So, are you able to tell us where you had to do this type of function?
Yeah, so I was CFO of a company that I think has been actually acquired now. It was a experience events company. It had complementary services that it actually plays into a little bit what you're talking about. So if you imagine going to a large corporate gathering, so let's say you have 300 employees. Actually, kick up that number. You've got 3,000 employees. You pull them all together. Let's say a large insurance organisation. You pull them all together, all the sales teams together a couple of times a year. You know, you have them in the room where they're doing some training, they're doing some partying, they're doing some, you know, got some entertainment. It's got a team building. All of those capabilities in it. Well, ultimately, someone organises all those things, and they organise everything from the creative element of what you're seeing on stage through to how do you get people from the airport to the hotel, through to organising a hotel, all those sorts of elements. Well, this company had 3 divisions. The division that put on the show, a division that did the training side of things, and then a division that did the logistics, you know, getting 3,000 people into a city, to a hotel, a series of hotels, 2 meals, yada, yada, yada. We hit the financial downturn in, what was it, 07, 08, I guess it was? 08, 09?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
And the production side still had work going on. The destination side, it's called Destination Management Services, is the category that they're in, of people flying around and things, started to take a fairly substantial hit.
Sure.
Particularly, I'm not sure if you remember, but back then, the government and everyone was having a go at anyone who went to Vegas or went to Florida or whatever for a meeting as being extravagant and out of control. Well, these things often served real purposes.
Right.
I mean, they meant that your companies were aligned and we talked a little bit about culture, that culture was maintained and that they were growing, they were aligning with strategy and growing the company. Well, suddenly all those things started to go by the wayside. So I had looked through in the books and looked through the benefit of having this organisation. And there was some complementary nature to it, but we had talked a little bit before about scale versus the decisions why you do things, whether it's scale or whether it's strategy. This one was a scale-based game. I mean, if you were big enough, you could really do quite well. It could be quite a lucrative area. If you were sort of mid-size, you'd make money in good years, not money in bad years. And I would say we were sort of in that space. So in conjunction with the private equity firm that owned us, I sort of pitched to them and got buy-in with them that we should offload this division. And it was my first time actually dealing with a major acquisition or sale, and dealing with that sort of whole investment banking side and the marketing of it, and ended up becoming the lead on that team. And yeah, we sold it to a very large European operator that was building scale. They already were here. It enabled them to geographically expand and probably double the size of the US business. So it was they were going the scale route, and for us it meant that we could focus back on a core sort of couple of pieces of business and grow that.
Very cool. So, review of concepts here. That what did Patrick just talk about strategically? And this is actually the first live example, Patrick. We thank you of a divestment. Strategically, he proposed to his parent company a divestiture, and so you can think of that under the finance zone as 100% issuance of equity. So thank you very much. So with that, Patrick, we're gonna quickly go through the externals. You already demonstrated how much each of our variables interact with each other. So Patrick's talked about his main supplier, his lifeblood supplier, which are the hours, the pieces of media that he's buying on a large scale. So we've gone through supply chain, supply management. Now, Patrick, I'm going to skip public reaction for a second and jump ahead to economy. You talked about having large market share in India and China. Mm-hmm. If you could either talk a little bit more about that in terms of buying power, having to do your supply chain management in new economies, or how you would approach going into, for example, Brazil and Russia, which you didn't mention. So presumably you're not there, right?
We are. We're pretty much the largest of both those markets as well.
So
they're referred to as the BRICS.
Right.
Brazil, Russia, India, China. And we're the largest in all of those.
So maybe we could combine those two factors, which is economy and supply. And let's talk about supply in the context of those four economies.
Well, I think you've sort of got to split. I'm a little bit, so on the term economy, are you meaning environment or are you meaning the economy of a particular country?
Well, we mean, we try to look at it as a variable. Maybe you can broaden our view here.
Okay.
But we try to think of the local artifacts.
Okay. Well, so I think there are two elements to this. There is actually maybe three elements. There is the legal framework, right? What you can and cannot do.
Another external variable.
For instance, healthcare advertising in the US. You've seen all the fun ads with all the side effects of all the products that basically make you scratch your head and wonder whether you should take those products. That is different here than it is in other markets. So that is a regulatory legal framework issue that differs place by place. You then have cultural issues. Words mean different things in different markets. You've got everything from how the distribution method works as to how you promote something. So there might be something that you buy at a supermarket in one country and a hardware store in another. And those are sort of the cultural elements. And then there was a third one, which I'm just trying to think what the hell it was right now, which was related to this, which is actually what the employees of your organization will do or not do differently or similarly or differently around the world. I'll give you one prime example. The work hours in the US are higher than Europe. So the way that we charge our people out and the basis of their value is different in the US than it is in Europe, for instance. They work longer, they work shorter weeks in Europe. They take a lot more time off and things like that. It is harder to, being an industry like ours, where you are very, very susceptible to the economy. There needs to be the ability to increase in size and decrease in size based on economic factors. That differs hugely if you think about the US, where you can sort of be employed at will and sort of downsize if the economy hits the skids. It's very different from France or Italy or somewhere where you've got 6 month, 12 month processes to terminate employees. So I haven't talked much about the BRIC states, and I am somewhat limited in my knowledge of them. But they are certainly where there has been a lot of economic spend in the last decade. It's varied considerably between them as to where the spend has been, and in terms of how long term it is. So I think each one has unique issues. India, if you read up about it, has a lot around bureaucracy. It tends to slow things down, and they tend to have issues around that. Brazil has certainly been on a tear. Russia is sort of one of those ones that they've just started spending heavily in the marketing space, but it's still in its infancy. And then China has been roaring along and is probably showing some signs of wear and tear here and there. So they're quite different elements. But on the economy, I think it breaks into those different areas. How people can access whatever it is you're trying to do, how the regulatory framework supports it, and then what your organization is actually able to provide in that marketplace.
Very cool. So, there you have it again. You should be thinking about your role in the context of the economy, the larger economy. Patrick described mature economy issues, and he's described, developing economy issues. But the point is, we've covered in a previous example. You're doing macro electrical work. You should know. You should be able to say that the price of copper has tripled in the last 9 years. That should be in your framework for thinking. And similarly, Patrick has described a lot of issues which should go into definition of your role and long-term view of your tasks, not just a task-by-task basis. So in that last discussion, we've covered supply, we've covered economics, and Patrick, in advance, you've covered probably everything we would have said about legal frameworks as well. So just quickly, is WPP a publicly traded company?
Yeah, it's listed on the British Stock Exchange, the FTSE, and we're a component of the FTSE 40, which is the sort of the big group, and it's depository receipts, which is sort of a, because I'm not sure whether people know that or not, it's sort of a mirror share, if you like, is on the New York Stock Exchange.
Very cool. So we've covered how public reaction, which really means investor reaction, in the past, why Ford and GM do business differently from how Chrysler did business. So, Patrick, it's very interesting that you mentioned that WPP is publicly traded, and on the other hand, your prior employer was owned by a private equity company.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk a little bit about how you treated things differently because of those realities?
I don't think there is necessarily a distinction based on public or private ownership. Actually, I might reverse that actually. Our company is 26, 27 years old. You could not have built an organization this size. And it doesn't mean that there was nothing there. It means that we've taken over a lot of companies. You couldn't have done that without access to public capital. So privately, it simply wouldn't have been possible to build something of this scale. There is often a notion that private companies are better at making longer-term bets. That is sometimes true, although I have seen public companies do a very, very good job of it when they've chosen to. I think that there is also a distinction. I've lived in London and New Zealand and here, and I think there is a unique distinction in the US where there is more of a desire to meet quarterly forecasts, and to some extent it inflicts a short-term thinking on many managers. You get punished if you don't make your results this next quarter. A private company to some extent has the luxury of not having to worry about that. So they can make bigger, longer-term bets that may well be more lucrative because they've got the luxury of time to do it.
Excellent. And, the Patrick's prior example of offloading a division, certainly, I imagine you took that on very differently from what you would now, right? If you were to propose offloading the division, your investor and your employer weren't one and the same, right?
Yeah, no, they weren't. I think ultimately, the strategies are the same, right? So I think divestiture and acquisition are two quite different things. On a divestiture side, I think if you're being public or private, the benefit to the company would have been the same. I think on acquisition, it's a slightly more complicated scenario because let's say that we looked in a crystal ball and decided that marketing services should go into something which wasn't considered complementary by the market, but we felt that it was. Let's say a search engine. Okay, so we decided that Yahoo was a good acquisition target, and I'm not saying it would be, but the market would punish you for that as a public company because it would sort of be a head scratcher that if you couldn't explain it well.
Right.
I think a prime example of this would be HP's acquisition of Compaq.
Okay.
Where everyone was sort of scratching their head and going, why are we doing this? You have two very different cultures, one sort of fairly high value, one not very high value. It is a harder sell. Now, in a private company, if you decided to make that call, it's yours to make. You've got to deal with your stockholders regardless. As a private company, you could still have a wide stock base. But to some extent, you can make that bet. One of the ones that I think is kind of an interesting one is if you look at someone like Hearst Corporation. Hearst Corporation, who was a primarily print group for a long, long time, but it has some very sizable TV assets. They have the A&E channel and a chunk of the History Channel and ESPN and things like that. Now, they're a private company. Public companies would have had a tougher time doing it. Murdoch did it, and with News Corp, but it was a tougher road for him to do.
Right.
And when he first did it, people were scratching their head about building a TV station. Yeah.
Very cool. All right, Patrick, so we're going to let you choose the order of the remaining 4 items.
Okay.
So competition, industry, audit, and technology. Which one would you like to talk about next?
Audit, I tend to view, audit is critical in any organisation. I think it has become it has become somewhat of a bad word because, particularly with Sarbanes-Oxley, it has got very, very intrusive. I think any organisation should have checks and balances that protect the employees, the management, and the stockholders. To some extent, all from each other. You need to have stockholders that are protected from incompetence. You need to have, and from just people committing fraud. You need to have management that is getting accurate information in order to make the big decisions. And you need to have employees that are doing the job right. So you need to have checks and balances there. I think that the audit language too often gets tied up with things like Sarbanes-Oxley, which is the legislation that governs many of the controls in organisations, and basically means that senior management have to know what's going on, have to sign off on it, so that they can never be the debacle there was after Enron and things, where everyone said we didn't know.
Right.
Basically, what it does is it provides a pathway where it's clear who knew what, when, and how. So I think audit is critical, but I tend to think of it more as a checks and balances and the verification of those checks and balances, rather than the sort of what I think has become a somewhat ugly word related to some of these controls, which you should absolutely be verifying in any organisation. Technology, I know, was one of the other ones there. I think it differs hugely in each organisation as to the role of technology. It depends very much good or service. It depends, you talked about competition a little bit. It depends whether there are industry-wide technology needs, or whether you are looking to be a technology leader, or whether you're looking to technology as a differentiator. So, for instance, advertising for many, many years, doesn't anymore, but for many years, basically had one technology provider.
Wow.
That dominated the entire industry. It was a company called Donovan Data Systems. And, so there is technology as a need to run your business. They basically had competitors come up and sort of take them out. So there's technology to run your business. That is just a base level. There is technology that can drive your business further. I mean, we talked about the media game, if you build better technology that can do things smarter, then that will become a point of differentiation. And then there is just sort of technology on a day-to-day basis, which is how you operate your company and how it can improve and streamline and make your organization more efficient.
Awesome. So
there was audit and technology.
Yeah.
We had competition. Competition is sort of one of the ones that you've always got to be paying attention to what's going on. If you don't know what your competitors are up to, you're dead in the water.
Right.
But I think the only advice I'd give on the competition is your competition may not necessarily be a direct competitor. It may be a complementary service that's creeping into your space. It may be someone big who is looking to acquire in your space. It could be an area that you're just exposed on technology. We talked about that, where basically someone could start up tomorrow. It could be with a new technology and wipe you out completely. Now, I'm trying to think of a sort of a valid example of that. It'll come to me. I'll think about it next little while. But there was someone who was banding around who I was thinking was you wouldn't actually expect that they would be seen as a technology company. As a competitor. But I'll think of what that is. So which was the last one?
So industry.
Industry.
Which in advertising, I think is going to be a function of competition and technology.
Yeah. And what element of industry?
Just the woes of the industries, or the takeoffs, the growth of the industry as a whole, and how you can ride the coattails of that.
I think firstly you want to be permanently looking at how you can position yourself as a leader in an industry. And then the last thing you want to do is a follow-up.
Right.
And I guess your place within that industry in terms of not just scale, but also, you can be, if you look at the consultancy industry, right, there are quite a few big consulting companies. You have the Accentures and the Bearing Points and the Deloittes of the world. But you also have Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey. Now, on a scale basis, I'm not too sure what the difference is. I would imagine that Boston or McKinsey are considerably smaller than the others. They are in an industry, in a fairly competitive industry, but smaller and a niche player. And part of that is the strategy they've figured out their place within that industry. So, Goldman Sachs, they have the, which is just down the road here, they have developed a place within the investment banking industry. They have not gone the route of a Citigroup or a JP Morgan Chase or in fact, those are the two predominant ones, into the sort of supermarket.
Right.
Bank of America as well, into the sort of supermarket environment. Now, they're in the same industry.
Right.
And they could probably have gone that way if they chose to, but they've chosen a different path. So I think it's just where you wish to be positioned in your industry and how you tie in with it.
Very cool. So, Patrick talked about audit. If you understand at a macro scale why you're doing many of the tasks that you're doing that you don't necessarily see the benefit to from an operations standpoint, but you understand the operation, and that's why the tasks connected to an operation are a pleasure for you. You get job satisfaction out of it. If you understand the audit aspects of what you're doing, I guarantee you'll get at least an increased amount of satisfaction from doing those tasks as compared to just doing those tasks without an understanding. From a competition and technology tied together standpoint, can you give an example of where you were able to make a pricing decision because you stood apart from the competition?
Sure. I mean, I think that with the basis of technology.
Sure.
Okay, well, a prime example is this. We have a company called Hogarth in our group. And Hogarth is got various different parts of their business model, but one of the ones that they do have, many clients these days are looking at their workflow process. And they're saying, we need to cut costs. Everyone's got challenges. Everyone has financial challenges, competitive challenges, etc. And everyone is looking to cut cost. Now, there is the cutting of an employee, which cuts some cost down. But there is also maintaining all the employees, but just being more efficient with the dollars you have, and using those to either grow the business, grow the marketing, or return it to the stockholders. Hogarth has built an interesting space in that they, with the use of technology, they are able to map out workflow processes and suggest improvements to shorten and streamline them. It doesn't mean the work output changes. Often it means it actually improves. But it means that they can get more bang for the buck with their exact same dollars they have. Now, that then creates a competitive advantage for us in that as part of the wider marketing universe, if you're saving dollars over here in terms of using more efficient processes and generating additional savings, the client can choose to, or not to, they may choose to do something else with it, but they can choose to take those savings, drive them into marketing, which drives sales, which then generates a higher top line and bottom line for them. So, that is certainly one area where I can think of where technology drives a competitive advantage, which can potentially drive the overall organization as a whole.
Very cool. And so we'll wrap up externals with technology changing the face of an industry. We as engineers, and here's a distinction between engineering and business in the mindset, Patrick. We as engineers, to use Draftsman as an example, when we were beginning to use computer-aided drawings to basically phase out drafting, we thought of this as a change in industry. We were going to engage a new industry and basically make extinct an old one. But that's not how you should be thinking of industry. You should be thinking of the by-hand draftsman and the computer-aided drafters as a continuum. So the industry is the same. It's the drafting industry, and the technology has driven a change, a shift in the industry. And I think advertising is a great example of that, where engineers probably would have thought of digital media as just being a completely different animal than the existing media, but that's actually not the case. Basically, you guys have proven, and probably your bigger competitor. You said you're the second company, right?
In Consumer Insights, we're the largest in our industry. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. So definitely the larger players in every industry adapt in that way. So you should think of industry and technology being interconnected in that way, and you should think of industry as constantly evolving. Think about the function that it serves, not the tasks that they do.
Okay,
So,
I'll give you an example on that front.
Sure.
You talked about the advent of the digital industry.
Right.
If you saw things in isolation, then you might think, okay, if everyone's going to be pouring into digital, and newspaper industry would disappear because no one would spend money on print ads.
Right.
They still keep going.
Right.
It's just the rise of a complementary medium.
Right. And then the function, actually, the information, the news, it's really the same function. So you can't separate them out as you do with physical entities. So we'll wrap up externals, and Patrick, we actually want to wrap up the interview. Thank you very much with coming full circle to strategy. Where in the continuum of activities that you described, first was getting up to scale, second was filling gaps. Where in that process did you come into the company?
I've been in the industry now for probably about 15, 16 years. And I would say, if you think that our company is the largest and has grown the most, it's 26 years old. So I guess I came in somewhere, somewhere in the middle, where this aggregation of companies was going on. Digital was not around back then, and it's certainly taken off. I've come in, but it's constantly evolving. I mean, even in a few short years, we've gone from digital being what you're looking at on your computer screen to suddenly everyone's looking at phones.
Right.
Now you've got the challenges of what fits on a phone.
Right.
And you've got Google Glass now running around the place. So things constantly evolve. I mean, one of the interesting things with listening to what you're talking about with the class is, I think, and this differs person by person, but what it sounds like a little bit when you talk about these is that the engineering sector tends to spend a lot of time talking about the what.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What does this do? The what and the how a little bit.
Actually, when you put in the how, that's it. That's all they talk about. That's all we talk about. What and how is the end of start and end of it. So.
Yeah, and I think maybe one of the areas that can help a little bit is starting to ask the question a little bit more of why.
Right. Very cool.
And why and where does it sort of fit within the universe?
No prompting here.
Why? Yeah. So it's just that's probably what I spend a lot of time on, because ultimately there are a lot of people who can get things done, probably to a far better degree than I can. But actually understanding context is a critical part of it. And unless you do that, it's very difficult. Well, firstly, it makes your job more enjoyable because you can figure out the value proposition of it. Why am I doing this? Well, if you figure out that you're doing it for absolutely no reason, it probably means you're vulnerable in your organization. Sooner or later, someone else is going to figure it out.
Right.
But if you're also looking at the why, it enables you to see other opportunities where you can utilize your talents and your work output to benefit the organization, which ultimately benefits you to a larger extent.
Very cool. Thank you.
Welcome.
Appreciate it.